Oranienburg. This peaceful provincial town 20 miles north of Berlin was to play a special role in the Third Reich, symbolizing terror and destruction. In July 1936, the SS had 50 prisoners brought from the Esterwagen camp to build a large new camp in the Oranienburg suburb of Sachsenhausen. It was to become a model for all later concentration camps. As the walls and barbed wire fences were being built even higher to hide the camp's horrific program from the rest of the world, Hitler was making peaceful overtures at the Olympic Games in Berlin. On the 13th of March 1938, German troops annexed Austria. Political opponents were immediately arrested and many were sent to Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Some months later, on the night of the 9th of November, the reality of violence and terror against the Jews was more evident. Synagogues were burnt down, Jewish shops destroyed, and nearly 100 Jews were murdered. This state-sponsored pogrom was silently tolerated and even welcomed by the German people. The next day, the Jewish population was swept by a wave of arrests. More than 26,000 Jews were taken off to concentration camps. This included 6,000 Jews transported from Berlin to Sachsenhausen. A number were murdered, some were detained, but the majority were released, only to be rearrested and incarcerated at a later date. In March 1939, German troops marched into independent Czechoslovakia. The universities were closed, and the students protesting against the occupation were arrested and deported to Sachsenhausen. Anyone who had thus far remained oblivious to Nazi expansionism were soon rudely awakened when, on September the 1st, Germany attacked Poland. 2 days later, the Allies declared war on Germany. The Second World War had begun. This was greeted with enthusiasm by the majority of the German people. The war spread rapidly across Western Europe. Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg, France, the toll of countries capitulating to Hitler's forces grew. The Wehrmacht marched victoriously through Paris. Hitler was one step nearer world domination. The occupying forces ruled through violence and terror. As a result, in France, as elsewhere, young resistance fighters soon fell into the hands of Nazi police and Nazi justice. Russian prisoners of war such as these at Minsk suffered the same fate as the political opponents of Nazism. These prisoners were transported to Sachsenhausen, where a particularly harsh fate awaited them. Peoples from all nations against which the Wehrmacht conducted its relentless war were locked up in concentration camps. By the end of the war, soldiers and civilians from over 40 countries had passed through the camp at Sachsenhausen. Although Sachsenhausen's capacity was expanded several times, it was hopelessly overcrowded. And it was not long before the first camps and Gestapo prisons were unable to cope with the rising numbers. From October 1941, the Jews were systematically deported from all areas in Germany to ghettos and camps. The camps they were sent to were mainly in the east, such as Auschwitz. In October 1942, 454 Jews were sent from Sachsenhausen to Auschwitz. The Gypsies, like the Jews, were also subjected to systematic persecution. Hitler's program was to eradicate these people from Europe, along with homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and so-called antisocial elements, the people with worthless lives, as the Nazis put it. Together, these people were the earliest victims of organized mass exterminations in concentration camps. As the war progressed, more and more concentration camps were needed throughout the Reich to accommodate the ever-growing mass of prisoners. The large intake of prisoners to Sachsenhausen caused a steady decline in living conditions. Each barrack was originally designed to house 140 inmates. Instead, 400 were crammed into the wooden hovels, suffering beatings from SS guards. From as early as 1933, most leading communists were under arrest. Social Democrats also paid for their anti-Nazi views. Julius Leber, a Social Democrat leader, was one of the first prisoners in Sachsenhausen. Released in 1937, he was later executed in connection with the attempted assassination of Hitler on July 20, 1944. Hans von Dohnanyi, one of the key figures in the attempt, was murdered in Sachsenhausen in 1945. Berlin priest Martin Niemöller was incarcerated in Sachsenhausen as a personal prisoner of Hitler. The cell block in Sachsenhausen was for punishments. Prisoners who contravened camp regulations or fell from grace in any way were placed in detention in a blacked-out cell. Here, food rations were even more meagre than usual. For many, a visit to the cells meant certain death. There were also special cells used by the Berlin Gestapo for interrogation and torture. Prisoners were suspended from these hanging posts by their arms, which were shackled behind their backs. For many camp inmates, imprisonment was effectively a death sentence. From August of 1941, approximately 10,000 Russian prisoners of war were brought to Sachsenhausen to be executed, mostly by shooting. Their bodies were taken to the crematorium for burning in the ovens. The concentration camp inspectorate were responsible for the administration and planning of all the concentration camps in German-held territory. From 1938, its offices were based inside the camp at Sachsenhausen. Theodor Eicke was its first inspector. He had previously been in charge of Dachau concentration camp. In March 1942, the inspectorate was incorporated with the Central Department for Economic Administration. The head of this department, Oswald Pohl, had previously pointed out the potential use of the camp inmates as a workforce. From this point on, the prisoners were exploited even more mercilessly as slave workers. Rudolf Höss was in charge of Department Group D under this administration. His department was responsible for the prison conditions and the murder of prisoners in the concentration camps and the mass murders in the extermination camps. Over 200,000 people were incarcerated in Sachsenhausen between 1939 and 1945. The camp was designed and built in a triangular shape. This particular form allowed optimum surveillance from the 8 watchtowers strategically placed along the 3 walls. Arriving on trains, the prisoners were forcibly marched and beaten on their way from the railway station across town to the camp. On this parade ground, prisoners stood for hours, morning and night, day after day, for barrack roll calls. From here, the view of the gallows was unavoidable. The whole camp was surrounded by a high-tension electric barbed wire fence. Escape was impossible. Desperate inmates committed suicide by throwing themselves into the wire mesh. There was dire overcrowding in the barracks. In each barrack there was a small single washroom containing 7 toilets, shared by over 400 inmates. This was the pathology lab. Corpses of inmates that had died from the effects of experiments which were carried out in the sick bay were brought here for dissection and examination. The dead were transferred to the mortuary. Later they are incinerated and their ashes buried. Just outside the perimeter fence there was a special camp. This held Allied officer class POWs. British officers who had made several escape attempts from POW camps were sent here.